Lesson 2 talks about the origin of life. And this is like a highly debated thing. We're just going to go through the book right here. But the first person that's the book mentions that really went through this was Redi. He was an Italian scientist. He basically was trying to show people through simple experiments that non-living things don't grow living things. So what he did in his experiment was he took chunks of meat and he basically exposed some chunks of meat to flies and some other chunks of meat not to flies, and he was basically trying to show people that, look, it's not the meat that grows the flies, it's the flies coming down on the meat, leaving something like an egg, and then that is growing the flies. His experiments were, even though they were pretty obvious, people didn't really accept what he was saying that well, but we do know that prior to this time, people believed in something called spontaneous generation, meaning that non-living things could grow life. We know that that's not true. All life comes from other life. So that moved on over time to Pasteur. And Louis Pasteur, he basically set up a similar experiment, but just a different place and time. And his experiment was a lot more accepted. He basically boiled soup broth and showed that nothing would grow in the soup broth. It wouldn't get all moldy and yucky over time. And that created this idea called the theory of biogenesis, which all life comes from life. So, the theory of biogenesis is that only living things can make other living things. This theory of spontaneous generation is the idea that life could come from non-living things, and we know that that is inaccurate. So, why on earth do scientists then think that chemical events in early Earth led to life? Since that's sort of like spontaneous generation. Well, I mean, basically, if you're looking at life and where did the first life come from, there's scientific views, and there tends to be sometimes like religious views. So, in like spiritual or religious views, the reason why scientists don't tend to look at those is because science specifically deals with experiments that can be tested and replicated and repeated. And because, religious ideas and, religious spiritual beliefs about Earth's creation cannot be replicated, then science basically just lets that go and doesn't study it. So that's how those two are just, it's not like they're fighting, they just, science doesn't work that way. They want to be able to test everything, and so they just kind of just work in different realms, essentially. So in order to figure out how early life could have occurred, there was just a huge number of experiments. There was the primordial soup experiments. There was ones that used more, taking into account more of the electricity and the earth, like the pressure and things that we had available to us at the time. Nothing yet has ever produced life, though they have gotten some of the basic building blocks created out of doing these experiments, yet no life from non-living things. And here's all the things you would need: proteins, and then a genetic code, and then molecules, which we've all studied earlier. So that is one area that is yet to be discovered as far as the concrete how life got here. And there won't be very many questions on the test about it, or, I mean, even in the book. So for cell evolution, how cells have changed over time. So in They have early fossils about 3.5 billion years old, and these early fossils do have some microbes in it, but what was there before then, they don't really know because it didn't preserve, it didn't stay as a fossil. So the first things they think were archaea, and they are a pretty sturdy organism that can live. There's some even today. They can live in extreme environments like boiling hot water in Yellowstone or in deep sea vents. So those were likely the early cells, and prokaryotes, which we know came before eukaryotes, they probably came sooner because they're simpler, they don't have a nucleus, and they can live in extreme temperatures. So later on, we start to see that there's photosynthesizing prokaryotes, ones that instead of needing to use chemicals for food, they can make their own food using sunlight. So cyanobacteria was an important thing that came on board in the oceans that helped make a lot of oxygen, and that oxygen there would get held to the earth by gravity, and it made something called the ozone layer. And that oxygen layer there, which makes up the ozone layer, protects us from a lot of the radiation from the sun, and that's why it's so important. The next part that I need to talk about is the endosymbiotic theory. And the endosymbiotic theory is actually really interesting. It basically is an idea that's fairly well accepted among scientists that early cells, like a bigger eukaryote, basically engulfed, and this happens through phagocytosis, it's called. It's just like engulfing another organism, and animals do this, or like even on a small level, all the time, and you can see it in pond waters happening live under a microscope. So this is a process that happens, and the idea is that a larger cell engulfed a smaller one, and these basically could respirate and have aerobic respiration, and those became the mitochondria of a larger cell. And then certain ones of those ended up also engulfing some prokaryotes that were photosynthetic. So these ones could make energy. The mitochondria ones could make energy using different things that the body had consumed, and the photosynthetic ones could make energy using sunlight. And so this bigger cell formed a symbiotic relationship, like you help me and I will help you, very mutualistic in that way. And the ones without chloroplasts, which ended up being chloroplasts, the photosynthetic ones, the ones without chloroplasts were animal cells. The ones with chloroplasts and mitochondria ended up being plant cells. So this crazy theory, what are the evidences of it? The evidences of it are that, interestingly, mitochondria has its own DNA. It has a circular, pattern, just like prokaryotes. It has its own ribosomes in both of the chloroplasts and in the mitochondria, separate from the rest of the cell, and it divides on its own. So separately from the rest of the cell, it will have its own divisions. So it's not necessarily part of mitosis. It goes through that with the rest of the cell, but then when it needs copies of itself, it just divides itself. So it's almost operating like a cell inside of another cell. I mean, everything's there for it to be a cell inside of another cell. So that's the endosymbiotic theory about how we got these more complex cells. So as you go through this information, I also encourage you to go and look at UC Berkeley's, and I cut it off here and I apologize. But I would encourage you to look at UC Berkeley's Understanding Evolution website. They have all kinds of misconceptions, and I'm so sorry I cut it off here in the video. But I would recommend that you look at that. I'll put a link there, but they have all kinds of misconceptions about evolution, what is actually known, what is not known, and stuff that's just gotten mixed in as factual, but it's not correct information at all. And it really fixes a lot of things. So check it out if you have time, and have a great week.